And lashes is a general term in the law that says you've waited too long, you can't do it now. You sat on your rights too long, you can no longer enforce them. Now those two concepts are related. Statute of limitations is you waited too long by statute, because the statute says a specific period of time. Lashes is without a statute set in a specific period of time, or simply the law says you sat on your rights too long, even if there isn't a statute. We don't want to hear about it anymore. Okay? That's all it is. But I want you to know these terms, because you're going to talk to lawyers and you're going to hear these terms. Yes, sir?
What's the law for? How many years?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about. As to what? As to murder, there is no statute of limitations.
No, it's a real estate.
I'm sorry?
Real estate.
Well, as to what? As to real estate? As to suit on a sales contract, 4 years. As to something else we're going to talk about in a few minutes, 7 years. I'm trying to be smart.
Right.
As to foreclosing a mortgage, 20 years. Different statutes. Set different periods. But even when there's not a statute, there's a general concept in the law called lashes, which is you sat around and waited around too long. Now, but that's not what we're here to talk about at all. But I want you to understand those two concepts, because that's why we have adverse possession. The law says, in general, if you own a piece of property, you better go out there and look at it every now and then. And under a certain set of rules, if somebody's been on your piece of property for 7 years, but it's not nearly that simple, and you haven't done anything about it, we're taking it away from you. Not we, the guy who was on your property. Okay? If somebody, these words they use, and they mention in the text, openly, hostilely, notoriously, adversely occupied your piece of property, obviously without your consent, for 7 years, and you do nothing about it, you don't kick him out physically, you don't fence him out, you don't have the courts evict him, then theoretically he owns your piece of property, according to statute and a lot of rules. And we're going to talk about those in a minute. That's the concept of adverse possession. Somebody adversely to you possessed, I mean, think it through, and then the words are going to be fine. If anybody ever says to you, what's adverse possession? Think about the words, you got it. Somebody adversely to you possessed your piece of property. Maybe he can take it away from you. Yes, ma'am?
Why is transfer on debt fall? Why does it fall under adverse possession?
That has nothing to do with it.
No?
Remember I told you that, maybe you were outside. This is a chapter of a bunch of stupid, unrelated concepts that have nothing to do with each other. Death is one of them, but we'll talk about that in 10 minutes when we finish talking about adverse possession. They have nothing to do with each other. Absolutely not.
Doesn't
Apples and oranges. Yes,
doesn't
sir.
adverse possession lead to potential criminal elements, like doing things that...
I'm going to talk to you about, there is a criminal section. You know, this is trespassing.
Right, but what I'm saying is like, okay, so what would prevent me from like threatening somebody, telling them I would kill them if they brought this up in court or something like that, and then just taking a piece of land from them? Like when I say criminal, I'm talking like a criminal organization, you know, intimidating small landowners from...
I guess that's possible.
Giving up their property. It seems very likely.
You need to let me go through the statute with you, which I'm going to do in a minute, and for you to understand all the elements involved to get there from here. What I said is the tip of the iceberg.
Okay.
Okay? There is so much more to it than that,
Yeah.
which we'll go through in a minute. And I'm really trying to explain just the definition of adverse possession,
Yeah.
not all the rules of how you get there, because there are a hell of a lot of rules. Here's the one thing you need to understand overall, and then I'm going to explain the Florida statute to you, is two things, and hopefully I'll come back to these, but if I forget, I want to make sure I said these. Number one is, remember, under this concept of somehow the squatter is going to get title, he's never going to have record title, right? He's not going to have the recorded deed at the courthouse. So in order to prove up his ownership, at the end of whatever it is I'm going to tell you he has to do, he's going to have to file a lawsuit and have the court determine that he really is the owner. So I'm going to tell you 10 more hurdles in a minute, but the 11th hurdle is you still don't have a deed. You're going to have to go to court and prove the owner. Okay? The other lesson is, if you own a piece of property, you own a piece of vacant land, you better drive by it every now and then. See, this one man's been squatting on your land for 7 years. He may end up owning it, subject to some requirements. That's the concept of adverse possession. Now, as the materials talk about, why do we have it? It's hard to justify, but it's the law in every state. And the philosophy was, you know, land should be used, and if you ain't using it, somebody else is. Maybe he should be the owner, maybe you shouldn't. I don't know. We got it. Let me tell you about the Florida statute. And of course you need to understand, as we talked about adverse a minute ago, this cannot be with the permission of the owner. Open, hostile, notorious, adverse. If the owner has given permission, this is not going to apply. For example, if you've got a lease for 7 years, don't think all of a sudden you own the property. The owner gave you a lease and you paid rent for 7 years. And you don't get to say, hi, I see, statute says 7 years, I've been there 7 years, I own it now. Hell no. You had permission to be there. Open, notorious, hostile to the owner. Okay? Trespassing. All right, now, here's the Florida statute. We got two kinds of, this is chapter 95 of the Florida statute. Just like most states in the book talked about this, we've got two kinds of adverse possession. The first is called under color of title. All right. What that means is you've got some sort of written document. But obviously it's not a deed. You don't have good title. You got something. You got a cocktail napkin that the owner wrote on and said, I give it to you. You know? You got a recorded judgment. You've got a claim of some type. You've got a decree of a court. Some sort of written instrument on which your claim is based. Okay? That's one type of adverse possession that's under color of title. Now, if you have some sort of a claim like that, and you've been in exclusive possession of the property for 7 years, and you have either cultivated the property or improved the property or fenced the property, then you have a successful adverse possession claim. Okay? Boil that one down. You've got a written instrument, and you've been on there alone, exclusively, hostilely to the owner for 7 years, and you've done something to the property, like farmed it, improved it, built a building on it, or normally fenced it, then you have a successful claim to adverse possession under color of title. Now, we talked about it a minute ago. You don't have a deed. But maybe you have a case now that you can go into court and say, Your Honor, declare that I'm the owner because I satisfied all those steps under the statute. Okay. And you can become the owner. The person you're gonna have to sue in that case is the real owner. He's gonna be pissed. He's gonna come in saying, no. You were only there 6 years, and I gave you my permission, it wasn't adverse and hostile, and you never farmed it, fenced it, or built on it, so you lose, it's still mine. Have a little fight, judge decides who wins. Maybe you win as adverse possession, maybe you lose. But those are the tests the court's gonna use. Yes, sir?
What if it's against the state?
Against the city,
Yeah.
there are certain rules about you cannot adversely possess property against certain governmental entities. I don't know. You can't, I'm virtually positive you cannot against the state, as to the state, the Florida, their property. I don't know on other business at all. I just don't. I don't know. Okay. So, that's adverse possession under color of title. You had some sort of a written instrument that you thought gave you the claim to be there. But it ain't perfect, obviously. If it was perfect, you're the record owner, you got a deed, we ain't even talking about this anymore. All right. Or, here's a real tough one. And this is 4 pages of requirements that I'm going to tell you about. But this is without color of title. This is the squatter. You have no deed or instrument whatsoever. You're just there. So here are the rules here. And I'm going to, maybe just listen to me for a minute, and then I'll come back and summarize them to make them short for you. But this is tough. First thing is, of course, you have to have been there for 7 years. Sole, exclusive, adverse possession for 7 years. You've got to be the only one on the property for 7 years. And within the first year after you got there, you had to pay all the outstanding taxes. If there were a bunch of back taxes, you had to pay them all. And you had to file a return with the tax collector or the property appraiser, saying, I'm here, and I am adversely possessing this parcel. And you have to do that within 30 days after you pay those taxes. You've got to file a return saying, I'm making a claim against this piece of property within 30 days after you paid all the old taxes. And we said you had to be there for 7 years. You had to pay the taxes for all 7 years too. You pay all back taxes, and the next 6 or 7 years of taxes until you've been there 7 years and you've paid all the taxes. And that's only a small part. And you got to do the stuff we talked about before. You got to fence it, or farm it, or build something on it. And now, we got 2 pages of rules of all the forms you have to file with the property appraiser saying, I'm claiming this property. And of course, the moment you file one of those, the property appraiser is required to mail a copy to the record owner saying, hey, this clown just filed a notice that he's adversely possessing your property. A light bulb goes off, well, I better get him off there, you know? And, okay? More property appraiser rules and stuff like that. 2 more pages of things that you must do with the property appraiser in terms of paying all those taxes for 7 years. And the property appraiser is going to put something in the public records that tells every title examiner, whoever looks at it for that 7 years, some guy has filed an adverse possession claim, so that if anybody takes a look at the title for 7 years, they know that some guy's out there in a tent saying, I filed a claim, I own it. Okay, all that's got to happen. Then maybe you have a claim to adverse possession without color of title. Now, there are 2 statutes I want to tell you about in a minute that are back into this, but let me go back and summarize those for you like I told you I would. Without color of title, you got to pay all the old taxes within a year after you move in. That could be 4 or 5 years worth of taxes. You got to pay all the old outstanding taxes. And you got to file a bunch of forms with a property appraiser within 30 days after you pay those taxes. And you gotta pay taxes for the whole 7 years you're living there. They're occupying it. And you gotta improve it or fence it or farm it, like we talked about. If you get through all that stuff, you may have a claim to adverse possession without color of title. But like we talked about before, you're gonna have to bring a lawsuit against the real owner. He's gonna come in and say, no, you didn't. And the judge is gonna decide whether you own it under adverse possession or whether he still owns it. That's adverse possession. They tacked on the end of this two kind of cool statutes. At the end, adverse possession. Coming from the foreclosure crisis as we all had after the recession that began in 2007. In 2010, they added a statute, 2011, I'm sorry. They said anybody who occupies, this just for information, you don't need to know this, to think about what we do now to trespassers who are trying to claim property under these statutes. Anybody who occupies a residential structure. Now this was all about foreclosure crisis, banks owned all the houses, nobody was in the houses, and these clowns moved in and said, I'm camping out here, this is gonna be mine, okay? If you move into a residential structure, and your only claim is under this section, and you don't file that return with a property appraiser, then you're guilty of trespass and can be arrested and sent to prison. So that's what it's all about. If you do move in, and you don't file that notice that the property appraiser is going to send to the owner, then it's clear that you're trespassing and criminal trespass. Going one step worse though, and this is where it really got bad. In 2013, they amended it to cover the even next stretch. And if you move in, and if you don't file a property return with a property appraiser, and if you try to lease that property to somebody else, and this happened all the damn time, you're guilty of criminal theft. That's a felony, you go to Rayford for that. So this is the banks and their big bucks and lobbyists lobbying the legislators. This is the political process, perfect. We got guys camping out in our houses, taking houses away from us under this crazy adverse possession statute you've had for 200 years. Help us out here. Let's make some criminal penalties for this stuff to make them quit doing it. So the sheriff can do something about it. Because until you make this a crime, you got to go to civil court and sue whoever that guy is and try to get him served and try to get the sheriff to remove him. That takes a couple of years. So now we're making these things crimes, at least for all these empty houses owned by the banks that had people camping out in them trying to become owners. 2 or 3 years ago in Boca Raton, there was one all over the news of some guy doing that. Bank of America trying to get him out of this 8,000 square foot, 4-story mansion on a lake that the bank owned in foreclosure. He filed a return with the property appraiser. You know, I'm here. This is mine. Try to get me out.
Yeah, that was my question. I was trying to wonder if before 2011 people were doing that.
Well, they could.
Okay.
But it wasn't that common because we didn't have all these vacant, houses. You know what I'm saying? People live in the houses. But after the foreclosure crisis, after a bank forecloses a mortgage and takes back a house, it takes them a while to sell it. And all you got to do is read the foreclosure notices and find out all the vacant, beautiful houses and figure out a way to pick a lock and get in, and you're in. You know, and it ain't easy to get the utilities turned on, and you know all that free. But the point is, it wasn't a crime. So now it is, and that's merely trying to close a loophole. Now, that's all about adverse possession. I think that's enough for you to know. If you own a piece of property, you got to be careful somebody isn't occupying your property and trying to somehow perfect their ownership and take title away from you. And secondly, realize the application of this not only if you own a vacant piece of land, but realize the application of this to, I don't even know what I did with, here, I'm sorry. Realize the application of this to the situation we talked about, where you own a piece of land, and there's a wall here, big 8-foot tall concrete block wall, and it's not located on the property line like it's supposed to be. This is your property. The neighbor built the concrete wall, and he built it right here. And for 7 years, he's been occupying your 2 feet. This is when it gets scary. And this is where boundary disputes come from. And one of the biggest claims anybody makes in a boundary dispute is, I've been occupying it for 7 years. It's mine now. I don't care where the platted lot line is. I have been occupying lot 2 and 2 feet of lot 1 for 7 years.
But has he been paying the taxes for 7 years?
Maybe.
Isn't that the staple?
That's a test under one of the 2 things we talked about, but not both. Under color of title, you saying, and I had some right to this. I had some document that gave me this. I had a building permit. I had a building permit that let me build that wall. Yeah, I got a piece of paper, Your Honor, that said I could build a wall. I did. Now, you didn't pay the taxes for 7 years, probably. But under color of title, if you had some sort of a claim, you might. That's why, here's what I'm getting at. That's why we give a damn when we look at surveys and we see a wall on a piece of property. Whose wall is it and who's been claiming? Now, as far as this guy's concerned, there's no real problem.
Yeah.
Except this. When he goes to sell, okay, now he's going to sell his house. And the buyer thinks he's got the land all the way out to this wall. And then the surveyor draws him a survey, and he sees, crap, I don't own all the way that wall. I don't even own that wall. I don't own that 2 feet. So he's got a title problem. Okay? This guy. This guy signs a contract to sell his house, and of course the buyer perceives that he's getting everything east of the wall. He isn't.
Oh.
His surveyor draws him a picture. Here's your lot line. Here's your lot 2. And you look at it, you go, well, what do you mean? You mean I don't own all the way up to the wall? Surveyor shows you no, you don't. And when this guy goes to sell, he probably, his buyer, might be happy. Hey, this is cool. I got not only the wall, I got another 2 feet. But the title of that 2 feet is in question by the location of the wall. That's why these things matter. And adverse possession is frankly what makes them matter. Because if it's been like that for 15 years, then really, there is a good, legitimate question of who owns that piece. And that's lashes. That's did you sit on your rights too long for 15 years not doing something about this jerk building a wall on your property? Maybe. That's what a judge is going to decide. But that's what we care about. Okay. Because adverse possession gives the ability to a non-owner to take your land away. Okay. Now,
last question on this. How often does this happen?
Long process.
well, this happens daily.
Okay.
This happens in most deals.
Right.
Because, no offense, people put the wall in the wrong place. They're all too cheap to hire a surveyor to lay out the line, stake out the line. And Joe Blow stands over here and his buddy stands down here, and they put a string across there and say, let's build a wall right here. It's the wrong spot, because those lot lines are not visible out there. Yes, that happens all the time. If in a real estate deal, if you're representing a purchaser of one lot, or you're a purchaser of one lot, and the surveyor is going to show you how big this is. He's going to call this an encroachment or an overlap, and he's going to tell you how many inches it is. If it's 1 inch, basically you're going to say, who gives a crap? But if it's 5 feet, it's a big damn deal. You know, it's kind of a question of degree. And maybe if it's 1 inch, nobody cares, and nobody's ever going to litigate over adverse possession, and who could care less, you know? And you first got to figure out whose wall is it? If it's me, and it's my wall, and I decided to build my wall inside my own property, no harm done. You know, I'm allowed to build my wall here if I want to. I just got to be careful. This guy's not going to adverse possess me for 20 years because he's using it on the other side of the wall. You know, but I mean, nobody says you have to build your wall on the lot line, but you ought to, because otherwise you're going to create some issues. Okay, that's adverse possession. Now, under the theory that the next unrelated, not stupid, but stupidly unrelated concept is eminent domain. Of how can you have your property taken away from you? Adverse possession, you can have your property taken away from you. Eminent domain is when the government takes your property away. Eminent domain is the power of the government to take private property for public use with just compensation paid to the owner. Now, this is talked about in the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. You know, one of the original 10 Bill of Rights all the way back was the idea that the government can take your property for public use as long as they pay you a fair value for it. The process by which they do that, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I want you to understand the words. The process is called condemnation. The theory, the basis, the legal basis for doing this is eminent domain, but how you get there from here is a process called condemnation. Now, we're not going to talk much about this except to understand who can do it. Every level known to man can do it. The federal government can take your land. The state can take your land. The city can take your land. The county can take your land. School boards can take your land. Public utility companies can take your land. They got to pay for it, but they can do it because it's for the public's benefit. Yes, sir.
Is the amount that they pay based off the property's appraiser's fair market value?
It's based upon the fair market
The
value,
fair market-
yes,
yes, so that's-
which is not necessarily the same as the property.
Yeah,
appraiser.
so that's
Yes.
what I'm asking. So
Usually
basically,
more. No, it is,
Is what the owner can prove is a fair market value, or is it what they can both?
the jury, what the jury of 12 people decide.
Okay.
We'll talk about that procedure in a minute.
Oh, okay, okay.
That's my next 30 seconds away, we're going to talk about how you get there. But that's the whole concept. But I need you to understand who's doing this to you, and then we'll talk about how they do it. Even going so far as, understand this, governments or quasi-governmental authorities who are doing something for a public purpose. We now have takings of entire blocks, blighted urban downtown Detroit blocks, by something called a community redevelopment agency, where they have the right to come in and take the whole damn block. Because it's a bunch of crack houses, and it's crap. And let's take it away from all these owners, and let's pay them all fair value, and let's put it all together, and we, the community redevelopment agency, will sell it all to Walmart. But let's get something good going here. The point is, that's the stretch and the reach of this, all the way from the federal government, all the way down to a city community redevelopment agency, if it's for a public purpose. And if they pay a fair value, they can do it. Those are the tests. And the public purpose test gets tested a lot. And that is a recent stretch of the public purpose is urban blight. You know, it used to be just for schools, just for parks, just for roads. I mean, that's the biggies. Roads, parks, utilities, you know, military bases, big stuff. Gotta have these things. Can't have one little Joe Blow over here in the corner say you can't have a military base here. Government needs it, we're taking it, but we gotta pay you for a life for it. Yes, sir.
Now, when it decide, is it, they go to a jury, or is it just, you know?
Well, I told you I'll get to it, all right? But I want everybody to understand the concept, if you will. Okay. Here's how condemnation works. Condemnation is the legal proceeding by which the government exercises the right of eminent domain. It's a lawsuit. The government decides it wants your land. Got to be for a public purpose. Know that without question, sometimes it's required, sometimes it's not, the government is going to try to negotiate with you first. They're not just going to file a damn lawsuit. City commission decides, this would be kind of cool to have a park over here. They're going to send the city staff out, the city planners out to try to negotiate to buy your property. If you guys can work out a deal, cool, you sell it to the city. Some jurisdictions require that as to different public bodies and some don't, but it doesn't matter. They're going to do that. They're going to try to make a deal. Make an offer, you say, no, I want this, they say, no, I'll pay that. You can't agree, then we're going to have a condemnation proceeding. It's much more complicated than this, but simply the government sues you and you have a trial and both sides bring in a bunch of appraisers, a bunch of paid guns to say what it's worth. Now, excuse me, you may fight them and say this is not for a public purpose. You can't take my house at all. To hell with you. But assuming we pass the first smell test of it is a good, legitimate public purpose. The owner can fight on two grounds. It's not a public purpose. You don't really need my house. Then you're probably going to lose. Secondly, you didn't make me a fair offer. Let's fight about the value. And that becomes a war of appraisers. Hired guns. You both hire a couple of appraisers to testify in Florida in front of a jury who knows nothing about the value of real estate, but is going to listen to these appraisers that do. And both sides are going to bring them in, and the jury is going to decide what your value is. And the government's going to pay it out. A couple of practical things that happen. Anytime that the government's going to acquire some property, like widen a right-of-way, widen a street, any of these deals, they publish a notice. As soon as the notice gets published, if you're the owner, you start getting phone calls from people everywhere. You start getting phone calls from appraisers, I'd like to testify for you. You get phone calls from lawyers who say, I'd like to represent you in the case. And the reason is, because in all these cases, the landowner's costs all get paid by the government.
No matter what?
No matter what, win, lose, or draw. So you can have, you can have F. Lee Bailey as your lawyer if you want. Bad example. You can have any lawyer you want, the government's going to pay his fees. You can have all the appraisers you want, government's going to pay their fees. And there's not going to be a win, lose, or draw. The government is going to win and they're going to take your property. So there really is no win, lose, or draw. They're going to get it. It's just a question of what's the amount. And if the judge says, nah, the government doesn't get to say, well, we don't like that. We're just kidding, never mind. The government has to buy it then. But the proceedings are a little more complicated than that. There's a certain amount that is set, that is paid into the court by the government, and there are rules about you got to get above it or below it to get a certain this or that or whatever. But you don't need to know all that crap, unless you want to be a pro, and if you do, you need to go take another course. The concept is to understand that's how it works. And they can do it, and they do it to widen the road, you may not want them taking your north 5 feet here, because you got beautiful rose bushes out there. That's tough, but they gotta pay you to buy your rose bushes. They gotta show us for a good purpose. Pretty easy to show we need to widen the road. They'll come in with traffic studies and all that, the road's overburdened, delay, of course they're gonna get to widen the road. Basically, you buy something on a public road, you take the chance, if you buy on a public road, that someday they may wanna widen it. Everybody talks about the swale out front of their property, that's frankly a good part of your grass front yard is owned by the government already anyway, and you don't even know it. It's a part of the road right away, But what I'm saying is, when they need more and they widen it, they're gonna pay you for it. But they're gonna get it, and that's when it usually happens. Yes, sir?
Is there like a set rules to make it for public good, or is it just whatever they can kind of prove?
I didn't follow that. Is
I
there
mean,
one?
for the first test to see if it's the better of the public, or to improve the property, or for the public road to widen it. Is there just as long as they can prove it's for for better, they can say anything they want?
Well, the judge, it's rare that a judge is gonna decide against the Department of Transportation and tell them that they don't need a wider road.
Okay.
So
as long as they can prove it, it can be almost any reason you want to take the road.
well, as long as they can prove it's for the public use, that's what the Constitution requires.
Okay.
But public use can be very private under that situation.
Yeah.
No, I'm not talking about a road. I'm talking about that situation I told you with the CRA. The CRA is gonna condemn an entire block, knock down the crack houses, and they're gonna sell it to Walmart. Now, is Walmart a public company? Do we all get to go to the park at Walmart? Hell no. But the public benefit was knocking down junk, improving the neighborhood, creating jobs, so it's not necessarily gonna be owned by a governmental entity, but there's going to be a benefit to the public. That's the concept. That's how it got so broad. It used to be for you to use it, the government. And now it's broadened into, is there a benefit to the whole public? Okay, that's the concept. Let me get through 2 more concepts at you. Go ahead.
Is it more difficult when, for instance, with the CIA, there's one person in the midst of all the crack houses who is...
He loses.
Okay.
We need the whole block. We say we need the whole block. I'm sorry about you. You're the one good guy in the block. We need the whole block. We can't sell it to Walmart with you guys. Sorry. Public purpose. Fair market value. I'm sorry you and your family have lived there for 70 years. Here's the fair market value of your house. Get out. That's Big Brother. That's government. That's eminent domain. 2 trickle-down concepts I want you to understand of this. It's not necessarily them taking the title to your property. What if they take away your development rights? What if legislatively they say, and you can't build anything there because we want green space? But they don't bring a case like this. They don't go through all this. They don't make you an offer. They don't try to buy it. They just tell you can't build anything there. That is also condemnation. The prohibition of the ability to do anything with your property is taking your rights away. If the government does that to you, you bring the lawsuit. It's called inverse condemnation. Your Honor, they didn't come offer to buy it, and they didn't bring a condemnation case, but they made it worthless. I can't use my property anymore. Make them buy it. That's inverse condemnation. Concept being, they might as well have taken it, I can't do anything with it anymore. Okay? That's condemnation too. The book didn't talk about that, but that happens all the damn time. Yes?
It happens all the time?
Yeah, it happens a lot. City changes the zoning code, you're no longer 8 units per acre, you're 2 units per acre.
didn't think about that.
So
That's brutal.
so even,
You're screwed.
You
Yeah.
wouldn't even
Your
try to
value
get
just
the
got
zoning
cut
changed
by
back?
4, you know?
You wouldn't even try to get the zoning changed back, he's making them purchase it?
I'm sorry.
You wouldn't even try to get the zoning re-changed, you just
We
have.
might, but, you know,
Most of the time.
somebody, obviously, you didn't have much political clout, because it happened to you, right?
Of course.
Now, you can try to go out and buy some political clout and get a change back, you know, but what I'm saying is, you know, a minor change in zoning, they do that all the time, that ain't gonna cut it. Yeah, the answer to that is, buy yourself some guns and go in there and fight it. That's not necessarily a taking, but a green space declaration, American Golfers Club up north on Federal Highway that's being developed now,
Yeah, there
those
were.
green space. If the city kept turning them down, plan after plan after plan, ultimately, if the city had said, sorry, you can't build anything on that whole former golf course, we declare it's green space, nothing. Then the answer is, they bring a case. You took it from me whether you said so or not because I can't do anything with it. So bye. That's inverse condemnation. Okay, book didn't talk about that at all. Well, I think that's important. I think it's real important. I think it's frankly more important than the other, because if the other's gonna happen to you, then you ain't gonna win. You know, it's a question of value. That's cool. What appraisers are for. But inverse condemnation, frankly, to me is a much more interesting concept. Okay, now that was another way to lose a property. You can lose your property by adverse possession. You can lose your property to the government by eminent domain and condemnation. The third way that you can lose your property, according to this book, is you can die. So, we're going to spend some time on this because you got to understand estates and how they work and what the administration process is. You all want a break for lunch now? Because this really is a totally different concept, really unrelated to the before. This is going to take us at least a half hour. Do you want to go ahead and do it? Anybody?
I'm ready to eat.
Go, let's do it. Okay, 12:45. 12:45, we'll talk about death and dying and how that takes your property away from you. Say again? Can you ask me a question? Oh, is the final next week? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're gonna focus more on this study with the project. I know
I thought
everybody
you
said
did pretty
that.
Yeah, I wanted to know if like there's like some rules that don't get plans to like say, oh, it's for the public better, or like you basically just
Basically,
regardless,
it's just-
and you can get one just to say,
Well,
you know, it's better for the,
Well, the whole fact that you can take an entire wide area.
What do you do to take it out?
In the book's example was
Whatever it
the
is.
Hawaiian Islands,
That's where the answer is.
that they're basically, there were only 72 landowners.
At what point in time?
Yeah, like until 1970, basically.
So you can watch the lecture.
Of the entire Hawaiian Islands, because they would never sell it,
Your
they
notes,
just
your
lease
notes
stuff.
are good.
And then, so then Hawaii, and
600 pages, nobody can read all that crap and get ready for a test. But focus on the things that we talked about in class. Clearly, the more I talk about them, the more important I think they are, and the more I'm going to ask you about them. Mary, I wish I had a good answer for you in terms of what can you focus on. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what questions are going to be in the exam, you know that, but I'm going to tell you that it's only going to be stuff we talked about in class, for sure. So if whatever is most helpful to you in terms of recalling what we talk about in class, whether it's watching the YouTube videos or whether it's studying your notes, but that's
I
it.
know it's like vocabulary is one thing for me, because I wanna be able to recall the terms and not to think too much about how I'm gonna write it out.
Okay.
So I'm gonna focus a little bit on vocabulary and then watch videos, so that's what I did last time. I didn't.
Yeah, you can't, you know, I know last time you had some problems and you did much better this time. And I think frankly, whatever you did to get ready for the midterm was a hell of a lot better than what you did last year.
I just have too much going on.
I know you did, I know you did. I know you had a child, I know your life was really busy, and it's a shame that you had to come back and do this again, but you're doing better, and I'm happy, and I was pleased with your testimony. Yeah, the things, the book this is the one good thing from the book, is, what is it, the beginning or the end, either one, is the words, the key terms.
Yes.
A few of them, I may have told you were stupid, ignore them. Hopefully your notes told you that, you know, but I think these are a great review.
Oh.
Make sure you know what each one of these things is, you know. And here, look what we just did. We did public use. We did eminent domain. We did condemnation. Of course, you need to know what those three things are. I may ask you a question about eminent domain, or I may call it condemnation. Eminent domain being the concept, condemnation being the procedure, public use being one of the tests, and I bet there's something here about adequate compensation. Just compensation, there you go. There's the four things we just talked about, and here they are. If you know those four words, you got it. And we talked about adverse possession. You know, so I think this to me would be a great way to review. If you can do that from every chapter, you're gonna nail it, for sure. I guarantee it. Okay, no? Okay, all right. No, I'm glad you asked. It really all boils down to, you know, I make up the tests, and I make up the tests on things that I think are important, and those are the things that I'm going to talk about. But when I do, I go back and I look at my notes, my outline here, and I remember, what do we talk about a lot? Well, those are the things I want to ask you about, because that means that I thought.
You use a lot of listing, or 5 of the terms that belong to this one.
Yeah, I meant to discuss. I'm gonna, when we get back, I want to say one thing that tripped everybody up on the exam, and I meant to say that, and I didn't do it because you weren't here yet, or when I handed out the papers to everybody else. But I want to make one comment about that. There's going to be some of that. But here's what's going to be different on the final exam. There's going to be a lot of that. Then there are going to be some factual situations that I'm going to give you, that I'm going to ask you to apply some of these things we talked about. I mean, like, I might say something like, what if you owned a piece of property and the government wanted to widen the road and take 10 feet? What do you think the process would be like? And you'd say, well, they probably would make me an offer, and then they'd have to come into court and in a condemnation proceeding and prove the public purpose of what they were doing, and then we'd have a jury, and the jury would decide the value, and I would get just compensation. In other words, I might ask you to explain a whole procedure rather than just what are the 3 words, you know. So my point is, on the final exam, I may paint a few factual scenario hypotheticals. There you go. What are we going to do? What would you do in this situation? And ask you to apply the concepts we talked about. And of course, in those cases, I'd want you to use the same buzzwords we just talked about here. You know, I'd want you to say just compensation and condemnation and public purpose, and condemnation as the procedure, and eminent domain is in the Constitution that gives them the right to do it. You know, in other words, I might ask you to write me a whole paragraph, write me a little story about it. So, and to that extent, the final will be a little bit different from this, where I'm just saying, tell me the 3 types of corporations, tell me the 2 types of net leases, tell me the, you know, in other words, the midterm was a little easier in that sense. They'll just spit it back to me. I'm going to have a lot of that again on concepts that we haven't, you know, that weren't on the midterm. Obviously, they're not going to be the same questions, but they're going to be a lot of questions that'll be, give me the 3 of those, give me the 4 of these, give me the 2 of these, you know. And then there's going to be those where I'm going to write you a paragraph and expect you to write me a little paragraph where you apply what we've learned to the factual situation that I'm giving you. That's what it's going to look like. Okay, up? All right, I'm glad we talked about it. Thank you. So, don't be silly. Thank you. And I do need to make a comment about one question on the midterm, but I'll do it. I'll do it when we come back.
Okay, thank you so much. I went back and watched some of the videos from last term.
I'm sorry, say what?
I went back and watched some of the videos from last term.
Good. Does it help?
Yes, and I was like, how did I
You know, I never watched one.
catch that? Why didn't I catch that?
Oh, okay. Well, good. I'm glad you're watching them. I'm glad there are some value. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm about to step out because everyone is sick. One kid gets sick, all of them get sick.
Okay.
Everyone's sick.
All right. See you later.
There.
I'm just now seeing your email. Seeing it earlier this week.
What do you guys imagine to that?
I don't know, Alex, was there ever a
No.
conclusion on that?
It never got done. I couldn't do it this week, and I know that she can only do
Yeah.
it, we're gonna do it after work.
Are you talking about the pictures?
Yeah.
I did half of mine already. I got the voice one already, I took care of it. Yeah, it was weird.
Okay, folks, you good?
I'm just gonna start making it.
I want to make two comments about the midterm. I intended to do this earlier and everybody wasn't here. Number one is as to one specific question. What do you own when you own a co-op? Only one person got that fully right. You own two things. Usually, I said to you, what are the three this and what are the two that's? Well, this time I didn't say what two things do you own in a co-op. I said simply what do you own, which implies one answer. No, there are two things. You own stock in the corporation which owns the building. And then that corporation gives you a lease called a proprietary lease. That's what entitles you to occupy your unit. You don't have to pay rent, but it's under that lease that you pay your share of the expenses and all, but there are two things. Being a stockholder in a corporation doesn't let you be in that unit. So you own a piece of a landlord, percentage interest of stock, and you have a lease from the landlord that says long-term, forever. There's no term of the lease. The term of that lease is forever. But you don't really own it, the corporation owns it. You occupy it as a tenant under proprietary lease forever. Two things. Okay, one other comment I want to make. On just about everybody's paper, and everybody did really well, I'm very pleased. On just about everybody's paper, there was at least one part of a question that you ignored. And I tried to circle that. Take the time, there are often two, maybe three or four parts of a question. After you've written down your answer, go back and look. Did I answer the four questions he asked? If you answer 3 out of 4, automatically you're getting a 7.5 already. So make sure you answered every part of the question. And not just charge off on the first part of the question and then think you move on to the next. Go back and make sure you got it all. Okay, everybody did well, I'm pleased. Because we're going to get panicked at 3 o'clock, let's talk about the final for a minute. Similar, it's going to be longer. Similar format, there's going to be a lot of straightforward questions about give me the 3 then and as. Give me the 3 ways to partition property, for example, like we had, but it ain't going to be that. But then I'm going to ask you factual situations to apply what you've learned. I'm going to say, here's a factual scenario. You own this piece of property and the government wants to condemn the north 10 feet. Wants to widen the road 10 feet. What's going to happen? And you're going to want to say, well, the government can do that under eminent domain as long as it's for a public purpose. And they pay me a just compensation. So we're going to have a condemnation proceeding with a trial. And first they're going to negotiate. If not, we'll have a trial in front of a jury and the jury's going to set the value and that's what they're going to have to pay me. And there you go. But I'm not going to say to you what's eminent domain anymore every time. I'm going to say, here's the situation you're in. What are you going to do? And you're going to want to use as many of the buzzwords we've talked about as you can, because I know you know that I believe that half of what this course is about the vocabulary and learning to speak the language. So to prepare for the final, 2 things. It ain't what's in the book, it's what's in your notes. And if you don't have any notes, watch the videos, because it's going to be the stuff I talked about. And I'll be going back through my notes to seeing what do I know we talked about at length. And that's what I'll be covering. I'll be making up the final. And I haven't done that yet, but those are my plans. But the point is, it's going to be stuff that I see in my notes. Yep, we really talked about that. And that's where questions will come from. And second, and so if you don't have notes, go watch the videos, because again, it's going to be the stuff we talked about. But the second, I think a good way to prepare, I told you my emphasis on vocabulary. I think it's at the beginning of each chapter, or maybe it's at the end, there's this thing of keywords. Beginning and end of every chapter. I would focus on what the book talks about in terms of the 20 pages of crud, but if you can define those 10 terms, and you can apply them to a set of facts, you got it all. And if you see any in there that we never talked about, don't worry about it. Okay, man, I thought it wasn't important. And not that that's the be-all, end-all, but that means it ain't gonna be on the test. If I didn't think it was important enough to take our time to talk about it, and of course my test for that is whether I ever thought you were gonna use it. In any event, so we'll do that at the end of our next class, which is our last class. It'll be at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half, we'll see. We're also going to do next class financing, and it's going to be on the exam. So stuff we're going to talk about. We're going to have 2 chapters left, hopefully, if I get through this stuff, and I'm going to try to speed it up so we can. Big chapter on mortgages, a little chapter on something called agreements for deed, which is another way to finance real estate. Those are the last 2 chapters, 21, 22, whatever. Mortgages and agreements for deed are all I hope to have left. And then the exam covering everything we've had in the class, including stuff we're going to talk about that day. Like what are mortgages and how do mortgage foreclosures work and stuff like that. Yeah, we're skipping chapter 20. Period. I'll tell you why when we get through 19, but.
What's the 20?
I'm sorry?
What's chapter 20 in the book?
What is chapter 20?
Yeah.
Chapter 20 is called escrow closings.
Okay.
Skip it.
Yep.
Study 21 and 22, we'll talk about them next week, and have an exam, and we're skipping the rest of the book because it's covered in your other courses. It's all about governmental rights and, permitting, and et cetera. Okay, does anybody have any questions on that? Testing and stuff? Because we'll get tight at 3 o'clock and everybody will want to go, and so will I, so that's all I got to say about the exam unless somebody wants to ask something else.
Yeah, you mentioned that only 2 persons.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned that only 2 persons got the question on co-ops?
I think, maybe only one.
Because
Got the 2 parts. Got the 2 parts right, I think. I'm sure that no more than 2 got both parts of that answer. Maybe only one.
okay.
And again, but I'll take a little bit of the blame for that. I didn't lead you to water and say, what are the 2 things? But I shouldn't have to. Okay. At least I don't believe I should have to.
You said the final is comprehensive to all the things we've done.
Of course.
For the midterm.
Absolutely. Includes the midterm again stuff, and yes, comprehensive all the way back, and including stuff we haven't talked about yet, we'll talk about same day. Okay, so you want to have a chance to go back and study that. We're going to have to talk about mortgages, and I'm going to want to be sure you got a basic grasp of what that's all about, because with no financing, there's no deals, so that's important stuff. All right. Death. Transfer of property on death. If you die and you own property, it's going to get transferred one way or another. A couple of concepts. And then we'll talk about them specifically. If you die and you don't have a will, that's called intestate succession. Intestate. Testate is with a will. Intestate, like incomplete, in negative, without a will. If you die without a will, statutes, Florida law, is going to decide what happens to your property. Now I want you to remember, and I'm going to say this again at the end, we're talking about property in your name. and you alone. If you own property jointly with somebody else, it's passing by operational law. Make joint tenants a right of survivorship or tenants by the entirety. It doesn't matter whether you had a will or not. Doesn't matter what your will would say. But if you die and you're the sole owner, or if you're a tenant in common with somebody, because remember, tenancy in common does not have right of survivorship. We're talking about that kind of property. Now, of course, we're talking about real estate. But this is your cars, your bank accounts, your stocks, your everything. This is what happens to your stuff when you die. If you die without a will, Florida statute is going to decide what happens. There is one concept I want you to understand, and it applies, the book says it applies to only intestate succession, meaning without a will, and that's wrong. It applies to both. And it's the concept of per stirpes, P-E-R, next word, stirpes, S-T-I-R-P-E-S, per stirpes. I'm sure that's Latin for something. And I'm going to show you what that means, because when property passes, the law says it passes per stirpes. If you die and your property is going to pass by law, let's say to your brothers and sisters, and we'll talk about how and when that might happen. But let's say either by your will, you said I'll give it to my brothers and sisters, or by statute, it's brothers and sisters. Okay? And at the time of your death, you've got brother A, you got brother B, you got sister C. By the time you die, sister C is predeceased. But she had 2 kids. Okay. How's all your property going to pass? Well, is it going to pass per stirpes? And per stirpes says descendants of a deceased taker step up and take their position. That's what this means. So how's the property going to go now? It's going to be 1/3, right? 1/3, 1/6. That's how your property is going to go. That's per stirpes. Per capita, which is the opposite. And our statutes don't do this. But the opposite concept is, too bad you're gone, sorry. Half and half, A and B. If a class is only the number in the class remaining at the time of your death, that's per capita. But per stirpes, which is what our statutes say our law is, and people put in their wills all the time, you can put in your will per capita or per stirpes in this case. You could say, I want all my property to pass to my brothers and sisters per capita. That means whoever's around the time I die. Or you say, or per stirpes. Or if you don't say which, our law says it is per stirpes if you don't say what. You're going to have this. So, you need to know those terms. Most stuff is per stirpes. Most people, this is what they would want to. This is really what they would want. Sorry she died. I'd like her kids to take her share. I don't want these two enriched by the fact that, the law had to decide one way or the other when you don't say, or when it specifies. So, this is per stirpes. where it moves on. This was per capita, where she's gone, it's only the two. Okay, now, knowing that, let's talk about Florida statute. Where does your property go? There is a chart in the book. It's kind of good, kind of fun, kind of close to what happens in Florida. It's on page 417. I'd like you to look at it. But we're not going to discuss it, except it gives you the flavor of what we're talking about here. This is, if you die without a will, what's going to happen to your property? Figure 17.2. Intestate, that's what we're talking about, no will. Okay. You can follow this down based on me telling you what Florida law does. Florida law first talks about your spouse. Florida law says if there are no children, the spouse gets the entire estate. If there are children, and all of your children are also the children of your spouse, then the spouse still gets it all. It gets weird when you have children from different marriages and stuff like that. And that's what's going on in this chart. If you have no surviving spouse, we're going to talk about that in a minute, on the right. But on the left, surviving spouse, there's all these different things that can happen. If there are no children at all, of course the spouse gets it all. And if you both have the same kids, we give it all to mama. But if you have different kids from different marriages, both of you or separately or whatever, then it gets weird. Okay. And what Florida's boils down to is, in all those cases, with all the weirdo situations of her kids, your kids, whatever, that Florida's going to give the spouse half. I don't know if that's what this graph does or not. No, this is weird. Florida does half. Maybe it is. I see some halves down here. In Florida cases, it's always half. If you got the same kids, the spouse gets it all. If you got different kids, the spouse is going to get half in Florida. Now, on the flip side, if there is no surviving spouse, like the whole right-hand side of this diagram, first level is your children. Second level is your parents, or the survivor, mom or dad. This again, you got no will. Next, brothers and sisters, and the descendants of deceased brothers and sisters. That's nieces and nephews and stuff like that, of the deceased sibling. None of those. Now, in each case, we're saying you got none of those, go to the next level. Grandfather and grandmother equally, or the survivor. Next level, aunts and uncles and their kids. And that's about where it quits. There are two concepts here. At the bottom of our statute, it says, all descent shall be per stirpes. So, it's without saying it in every one of these statutes, it's all per stirpes. That's what's going on in Florida, and this kind of shows you this is a sample state, and I think it's probably pretty close. Okay.
It says at the bottom there, multi-state, but I mean, there's